Our Earth is a marvel. Its forces created the continents, our home, each of them unique, each shaping those who live on them. The Inuit are masters of survival in the eternal ice. In Canada, the wilderness is almost invincible. So the rule here is people stand by each other.
It usually comes down to the fact that the landscape is much bigger than we are.
Mexico is marked by dangerous volcanoes. They were sacred to the Aztecs. Since their time, religion has been part of everyday life in Mexico, as is death.
So that's why we celebrate death.
The center of this continent is characterized by the fertile plains of the USA. It's where the notion of a land of unlimited opportunities was born.
The opportunity to own land, the opportunity to be able to do whatever you want.
The American dream was defined by individual freedom.
Those are things that are central to what it means to be an American.
North America, a continent with many faces. North America's natural icons are world famous. Monument Valley, the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains. They bear witness to the great movements of the continent. Most recently, the Ice Ages changed its shape extensively. The ice ground down the plains in the interior, filled up the Great Lakes, and carved the Niagara Falls into the landscape. The Ice Ages were also the initial spark that ignited American history, especially the last cold period 15,000 years ago changed North America forever. At that time, an enormous sheet of ice reached as far as the latitude of New York. It bound so much water that the sea level dropped significantly. This was especially noticeable in the northwest of the continent. A land bridge formed between what is now Alaska and Asia, Beringia. This land connection also changed the ocean currents.
Ultimately, this meant that the moisture from the North Pacific could no longer penetrate so far north. And that in turn meant that it was relatively dry, at least in the low-lying areas of this region where there was practically no ice. And that was a kind of refuge area for animals and also for plants. Then, during the Ice Age, they were able to hibernate there, so to speak.
Many animal species migrated over the land bridge into North America, mammoths as well as reindeer. The animals were followed by humans who roamed the land as hunter-gatherers, and so they reached the continent, which was probably virtually uninhabited until then. In the north, they encountered a hostile landscape, the polar region, a tundra. Nevertheless, the immigrants made the region their home until today.
So although we evolved as a naked, hairless ape in Africa, we've been able to adapt to vastly different biomes, different ecosystems around the world, such as the freezing cold Arctic tundra of the high Canadian Arctic, where Inuit cultures and societies thrive under an environment which is very, very different from when we first developed.
The First Nations, which include the Inuit, succeeded because they responded to the challenges of nature with specially developed cultural techniques. They lived mainly from hunting and fishing. Wide snowshoes prevented them from sinking deep into the snow. Lined hooded jackets, called parkak, kept them warm. Our word parka also comes from them. The Inuit way of life is semi-nomadic. They only seek out permanent settlements in winter. Until the Canadian state forced them to settle down in the mid-20th century.
It meant that there was a change in absolutely everything. It meant there was a change in Inuit diet. It meant there was a change in Inuit economy, because the Inuit were meant to take part in the wage economy. So absolutely everything changed when Inuit were moved from the land to communities.
These were not the only problems for the Inuit. The overall conditions were bad. The huge distances and the weather prevented construction of a road network, so the settlements could often only be supplied by air. This made food in the supermarkets extremely expensive. But the First Nations continued to maintain their traditional cultural techniques and still go hunting or foraging for mussels to this day. The shellfish are an important source of protein. At new moon and full moon, the water sinks so far at low tide that caves form under the ice.
Look into this one.
That looks safer.
Going into the caves is very dangerous. The ice layers can fall or be shifted by the returning tide so that the exit could close. The women are lucky today. They've found plenty of mussels.
Aether, watch out for the incoming tide.
Every venture under the ice is a race against the tides. The Inuit women win it because they've learned over generations to get along with the ice and its threats. This is how they've managed to survive, even though some of their most important traditions, such as whaling, are now banned.
The kind of story that we need to share more of is that we have come from a strong, resilient people, grounds us today so that we can continue to work towards making sure Inuit into the future continue to thrive.
The permafrost ends just south of the Inuit areas. This is where the nature that Canada is famous for takes over. With an area of around 300 million hectares, Canada has the third largest forested area in the world. Its pristine nature is no coincidence, because lying just below the surface of the land, there's a geological feature with tremendous impact: the Canadian Shield. It was also formed during the Ice Age. Over tens of thousands of years, glaciers have worn away the surface of Canada. All that remains is the hard granite rock that forms the core of all the continental plates. In most other landscapes of the world, this granite layer lies buried kilometers deep under sediment. For Canada, this means that water collects here as if on asphalt. Because there are no deep valleys for large river courses in the abraded peneplain, only a fraction of Canada's 2 million waterways and lakes are navigable. And the Canadian Shield has another shortcoming.
It is rich in minerals, but has a very thin topsoil, so it's not very good for farming. And you can really tell in where the Canadian population lies, most of the farming population has had to find land off the Canadian Shield.
This is why, to this day, 80% of Canada's population lives in the south of the country, in a strip only 100 miles wide on the border with the USA. Almost all the big cities like Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver are located here. The north remains a real frontier area. It's almost impossible to penetrate the wilderness and make it permanently accessible. This is precisely why it plays a crucial role in the Canadian view of history.
It has rarely been in the Canadian story one of conquest, one of defeat, one of settlement. Instead, the Canadian story or Canadian culture tends to acknowledge the resilience of the frontier, the fact that it will outscale us, outpace us, outnumber us, and it will often surround us.
Since the end of the 19th century, the Canadian state has been recruiting new immigrants in Europe to help develop the country's valuable resources. The newcomers were settled in so-called block settlements, small village communities that together were meant to defy nature. With its own police unit, the Mounties, the state not only protected them, but also the development of important infrastructure, such as the railway. This is another reason why Canadians have a very special relationship with their government.
It usually comes down to the fact that the landscape is much bigger than we are. And so we turn to some kind of external federal system to hold us together. The expectation is that this federal system or a government larger than ourselves should be able to support institutions that otherwise couldn't survive just based on individual choice.
In winter, Canadians are especially dependent on government organization. In Ottawa, for example, there are 170 centimeters of new snow every year. Montreal alone has to spend the equivalent of 120 million euros a year on snow clearance, just to transport the masses of snow to the outskirts of the city.
The idea that experiencing winters, experiencing harsh winters is something that we all do together, that we will come out the other side of, and it's something of a community building exercise.
The idea of community permeates public life as well as the leisure time of Canadians. Canada has about half of the world's ice hockey rinks. Unlike in the neighboring USA, ice hockey is not just a competitive sport here, but part of everyday life and a game for everyone. To keep it that way, free ice hockey rinks like this one in the national capital, Ottawa, allow in anyone who wants to play.
It's so supportive, and you feel so welcome most of the time, and everyone's just so supportive of each other, and yeah, it's really fun. I'm always having fun when I'm playing hockey, so.
To maintain the ice surface throughout the winter takes a lot of work, a job that is mainly done by volunteers, like Al Arsenault. He puts in 20 to 30 hours a week during the season.
I think it's important to have something like an outdoor rink in a community. It brings families together. It gets the kids away from their social media and away from the video games. And the parents also come out, and it gives them a chance to establish relationships with other families. It just helps to build the community as inhabitants, people who enjoy that. So for me as a volunteer, that's my way of giving back to the community.
Neighborhood initiatives like this are not unusual. Almost 80% of Canadians over 15 do volunteer work. For example, Operation Red Nose. Volunteers drive tipsy party guests home during the Christmas season in their own cars. To this day, there's also great state and city welfare for the population. And unlike in the neighboring USA, all Canadians are covered by social benefits and statutory health insurance. In the south, in Mexico's Yucatan, North America pushes up into the tropics. At first glance, Yucatan seems like a paradise. In fact, nature presents a challenge here as well, because the soil consists of porous limestone. Rainwater seeps away very quickly. A natural disaster that happened 66 million years ago didn't improve settlement conditions at all. An asteroid headed for Yucatan and hit with the force of more than 200 million Hiroshima bombs. Within 5 hours, the Earth's entire atmosphere was darkened by material thrown up by the impact, dust particles, sulfur, and the soot from gigantic forest fires. A global winter set in and lasted for decades. A mass extinction followed, which not only killed the large dinosaurs, but also 3/4 of all other living creatures. With the end of this catastrophic period, the temperatures rose again. The rainforest as we know it today conquered the land. It thrives in the rains of the tropical region, yet only special plants survive here because while the heavy downpours provide enough water, the rain also constantly washes away the soil. In many places, the humus layer is only a few millimeters thick. The rainforest flora has adapted to this, but many other plants lack the nutrients. Yet people still managed to conquer even this adverse environment. The crater rim of the meteorite impact shows a geological phenomenon that made it possible. Caves have formed around the compact rock of the crater rim. Here, rainwater doesn't disappear without a trace in the karstic underground. Where the rock is especially porous, it collects in cavities, so-called cenotes. There are about 3,000 of these freshwater reservoirs on Yucatan. Archaeologists suspect that people were attracted to them early on. But exploring the water-filled caves is dangerous. Time and again, divers have had fatal accidents. In 2020, a German-Mexican archaeological team was investigating the jailhouse cenote. The reason was that amateur divers claimed to have found human bones down here.
The only possible explanation of how this person reached the place where his skeleton was found is that he did so when there was no water, when the cave was dry. This was an amazing realization for me, and I wanted to know more about it.
The last time the caves were dry for a longer period was about 10,000 years ago. Was Yucatan already populated at that time? The divers did indeed make a find. They discovered a human hip bone. And nearby, a skull. The findings suggest that people discovered and used the caves and their fresh water, which at that time emerged as springs near the ground at a very early stage.
It is a combination of the protection the cave provided from bad weather and large predators such as the American lion or saber-toothed tiger or short-faced bear. All of this makes caves an extremely important place in the environment because they provided shelter and water, and all our life is tied to water. We cannot exist without water.
Laboratory tests confirmed the age of the finds. They proved that the fresh water of the cenotes enabled people to live on Yucatan as far back as 10,000 years ago. So the peninsula was settled much earlier than previously thought. Around 8,000 years later, people on the Yucatan created a unique, advanced civilization. The Maya. They built temples and large cities. Even 2,000 years ago, up to 200,000 people lived in them. Yet the rainforest could actually only feed 1 to 2 people per square kilometer. The secret of their success lay in their sophisticated agricultural techniques. The Maya succeeded in optimizing the poor soil of the rainforest. They added lime to the soil, significantly enhancing its nutrient content. A strategic combination of vegetables that support each other, the three sisters, pumpkin, beans, and maize, ensured that the soil was not depleted by cultivation. Above all, the Maya continued to cultivate this then inconspicuous plant, teosinte, today maize.
Maize, in its original form, was a tiny little hard husk like this. And over evolutionary time, over natural selection, we've expanded that into this grotesquely swollen, fruit-bearing structure solely for the purpose of human consumption and not really for its original purpose of reproduction for the plant.
The highly cultivated maize plant can use sunlight much more efficiently than other plants. Its shallow roots can also absorb rain directly at the surface before it seeps away. With its plump cobs, maize is a kind of magic weapon in the rainforest. And it's now widespread all over the world. Maize is now the world's highest yielding staple food crop, ahead of rice and wheat. Over 1 billion tons are harvested each year. For humans, however, mainly as animal feed. In Mexico, where corn originated, an old tradition lives on. Corn tortillas, tacos, and nachos provide their typical finger food. 40,000 tortillerias in Mexico still use the original Mayan processing method, in which maize flour is treated with lime to produce a particularly smooth dough. To the west of Yucatan, in the heart of Mexico, volcanoes shape the landscape. It's dominated by their mighty peaks. Mexico is the meeting point of two volcanic zones. The Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt stretches over 1,000 kilometers across the continent. And another active volcanic arc runs along the edge of the plate, along the entire west coast. The constant friction of the continental plates generates an average of 80 earthquakes per day. In addition, 46 active volcanoes in Mexico pose a permanent threat to human beings. But they are both a curse and a blessing. Their ash fertilizes the soil of the plateau created by the volcanoes. Meltwater flows from their peaks onto the fertile plateau. It has always been a place that has attracted people. As the pyramids of Teotihuacan show, these imposing structures replicate the mighty mountains. The Teotihuacanos considered them sacred. Just like many other great cultures, such as the Aztecs, they all have beliefs in common in which volcanoes play a central role.
Legend has it that the first humans were created thanks to the sacrifice of the gods in a bonfire. That is, through fire, the gods sacrificed themselves, threw themselves into the fire so that they could give us their blood. So the volcano was always present. People had a lot of respect, but also a lot of reverence for the volcanoes because they caused creation. They gave birth to life.
A mural from Teotihuacan illustrates this idea. The blood of deceased people flows into a mountain and comes out again as spring water at the bottom to water the fields. The sacrifice is a prerequisite for new life, and life is an eternal cycle. With the Christianization of Mexico, some aspects were adopted from earlier religions.
When a tree drops its fruit, it does not mean that the tree is dead. It means that a new cycle begins. Within the Catholic Church, there is no such renewal. Death is a punishment. Man was once supposed to be eternal, but as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, death arose as a punishment. But in our ancient conception, it was not a punishment, it was renewal. One cycle ends and a new one begins.
To this day, the Christianized Mexicans have not allowed their traditional ideas to be taken away from them, even if Aztec pyramids were deliberately built over by churches like the one in Cholula. Their belief in nature has survived and shapes a mixed religion in which indigenous beliefs, rites, and gods are combined with Christian traditions.
This is what has made Mexico such a religious country in the long run. Religiosity has been with us for thousands of years. Mexicans need this spirituality. It is part of our personality.
This is especially evident during Mexico's most important festival, the Day of the Dead. According to Mexican belief, the dead return to their relatives on this day. For example, the Núñez Cruz family in Mexico City. The grandfather of the family died just last year. Food and drink are offered to him and others on a small altar. This festive meal is prepared to give thanks for the life of the deceased. In ancient cultures, on the other hand, mourning the dead is considered disrespectful. To this day, for many Mexicans, commemorating death is not only associated with mourning.
People mourn the loss of a loved one, but at the same time, we give thanks to Mother Earth, who welcomes them back. That is why people also celebrate death and accompany the dead person with music to their funeral.
Little skeletons called calaveras are supposed to take away the terror of death. Whereas elsewhere the returning dead only feature in horror stories, in Mexico people joke about death. On the table are tamales, steamed packets of maize or banana leaves, and the deceased's favorite foods. Scattering flowers is also part of the tradition. The petals are meant to show the deceased the way home.
We use flowers not only because of their outer beauty or because of their splendid colors, but because Mother Nature has endowed them with aromas that go beyond the tangible aspect, so to speak. It is not only about the visible beauty of flowers here on Earth, but also about the scent they release. These aromas can cross the threshold between us, the living, and the dead. The dead recognize the scent, and that is the only reason they can return to visit us.
Following the celebrations at home, the families visit their deceased at the cemetery. Celebrations take place over the Catholic holidays of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. But there was also a celebration around this time in ancient Mexico.
Strangely enough, the festivities fell at the same time that the Catholic Church commemorates its deceased. According to Catholic belief, however, one only remembered the deceased person, said a prayer, and that was it. But for the pre-Hispanic people, it was about creating a way for the dead to approach, and that has evolved and become very big.
Because of its unique blend of Christian and pre-Hispanic customs, the Day of the Dead is recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage. The fact that these traditions meet at all is also due to the peculiarities of the continent. Off the east coast of North America, the wind became the decisive factor. It virtually drove the Europeans across the sea. Because the heat at the equator and the rotation of the Earth ensure constant wind movements, the trade winds. They blow reliably from Europe towards the American continent. Westerly winds in the north take Europeans back home.
It was this global pattern of atmospheric circulation that drives the pattern of winds around the world, which dictated where these transoceanic trade routes were established, which dictated where the fortresses and ports and cities were founded. It determined the entire pattern of European empire building and colonization. And we still see the fingerprint of those wind patterns in the world today.
It was mainly Protestant Christians from England who sailed to the east coast of the American continent with the trade winds, for example, the Pilgrim Fathers on the Mayflower in 1620. They were Puritans and, as Calvinists, particularly radical supporters of the Reformation of the Catholic Church, initiated by Luther and furthered by John Calvin. They believed that it had failed in their home country, and they wanted to do better in America.
So it's like the Israelites in the Old Testament. We are the chosen people. We are God's people. God has now given us the task or the opportunity to found a society organized purely on the basis of the Bible in the woods of Massachusetts. Therefore, we have the chance to reform the world.
But this world was not as empty as Europeans later liked to claim. The mounds of Cahokia in the Midwest are just one testimony to the many different indigenous cultures living on the continent before the arrival of the Europeans. Around the year 1000, a city arose here where between 10 and 40,000 people may have lived. Little is known about them or about other indigenous cultures in what is now the USA in the time before Columbus.
What we can say for sure is that there were not just nomads and a few hunter-gatherers, but there were entirely differentiated Indian societies. And this idea of an empty continent just waiting for European settlement is actually part of the European justification, the ideology for expansion, and ultimately for the destruction of the Indians.
Driven by their supposedly divine mission, the religious refugees from Europe felt entitled to expel the indigenous inhabitants. Time and again, there were armed conflicts between settlers and indigenous people. Time and again, peace treaties were concluded, and time and again, they were broken, mostly by the Europeans. The further the settlers penetrated into the land, the worse the situation became for the indigenous people. Over 3 centuries, the indigenous population was reduced to a fraction of their original numbers and forced into reservations. Among today's Americans, there are hardly any descendants of the indigenous population. Only 3% of the population describe themselves as indigenous in census surveys. The country is dominated by a white majority, a Christian majority. It's divided into dozens of subgroups, such as Baptists, Methodists, or Lutherans, because along with the religious refugees, the trade winds also blew their aspirations to America.
North America has always been a market of religious ideas, where many different groups persecuted in Europe were able to realize their ideas of a good, God-fearing life. So that it was precisely the moment of religious tolerance that led to an intensification of religiosity and piety.
New movements kept emerging. such as the Pentecostal movement at the end of the 19th century. American piety also produced relatively extreme groups, such as the Mormons. Likewise, groups described elsewhere as sects, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientology, are tolerated in the USA. Freedom of religious belief is part of the founding ideology of the USA. An ideology that's closely linked to the great wide plains in the country's interior. The USA's fate is determined by the unique shape of the continent. During the shifting of the Earth's plates, mountain ranges were pushed up on both coasts, the Appalachian Mountains in the east, the Rocky Mountains in the west. Like a gigantic flat wedge, a 2 million square kilometer landscape lies between them, the flat, vast interior plains. And it's precisely here that the glaciers of the Ice Age deposited nutrient-rich rock debris from the north of the continent, loess. Except the Europeans were reluctant to venture into the interior for almost a century.
For long periods of American cultural history, the wilderness actually stood for danger, for threat, for something that had to be overcome, that had to be destroyed.
Then, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the so-called Homestead Act. This set out that anyone who cultivated a vacant piece of land for 5 years could become its owner. Although westward expansion had already been in full swing for several decades at the time, the Homestead Act triggered a veritable run on the West.
There's a tradition in American life of owning land, of building up properties. Those are things that are kind of central to what it means to be an American. The opportunity to own land, the opportunity to be able to do whatever you want as long as you work hard. Those are core values of the United States and of the founding of it.
Those who stayed behind soon began to receive fantastic postcards from the pioneers. They showed a land where everything, typically American, seemed to be bigger and better than anywhere else, even if that was an exaggeration. Because the settlers didn't just reap rich harvests. The open, wide landscape was a gateway for tornadoes and sandstorms. Time and again, these destroyed everything the newcomers had built, but they were stoic in their defiance of the conditions. Courage and risk-taking paid off. The settlers became very successful, as the land behind the Appalachians was extremely fertile. To this day, the Midwest is the breadbasket of the USA. After World War II, American farmers deployed sophisticated irrigation systems, resulting in successful mass agricultural production, even in the adjoining dry prairie out towards the west. From the beginning, the success story of the Midwest was driven by the expansion of the transport network. Within 40 years, the railway connected the east and west coasts. Since 1890, a dense rail network has crisscrossed the entire country, but at the cost of hundreds of fatal work accidents. The rail network was followed by the expansion of roads. These enabled Americans to conquer even larger areas. Cities grew alongside the highways, and the suburbs emerged. It was the urban answer to the dream of having one's own vast country. Typically, Americans build single-story houses over a large area.
As the population spread west, you have the frontier, you have these big cities that just go out for miles and miles. It's a really fascinating part of American life that doesn't really exist in other places.
But lots of space also means long distances. Taken together, Americans travel around 90 billion kilometers by car every week. 86% commute by car.
In a lot of ways, the car has a parallel to the Old West cowboy myth of being out on the trail, of being able to conduct business and move as quickly as you want by yourself, and being self-reliant and being sort of engaged in whatever it is you want to be engaged in without anyone else's interference.
Because commuting by car takes up a lot of time, they do as much as possible on the road. It's not for nothing that in-car cup holders and roadside drive-through restaurants were invented in the US. Drive-through deals are not just for fast food. Americans also want to be able to visit pharmacies, strip clubs, or churches in their cars.
The drive-through is a really strong metaphor for American life. You turn off of the road and go and buy something really quickly and then move along your way. And that feels very much like the social fabric of America in a nutshell.
The car almost became like a member of the family. This is underlined by events like this. Prior to a Philadelphia Eagles game, fans gather in the car park for a tailgate party. It's a picnic where everyone brings their own food and drink, preferably preparing and eating it at the open trunk of the car. For many, the party in the car park is more important than the game itself. A third of them don't even watch it.
When you think about tailgating as a sort of feature of American leisure, it's something that really represents being in control of your experience, having something that you travel to where you want to go, you bring exactly what you want to bring with you, and you can personalize your experience. You're in complete control of it.
And almost 10 million Americans celebrate this sentiment with a personalized number plate. In the southeast, the USA even extends into subtropical latitudes with a warm, humid climate. Cotton grows well here. No other country exports as much of it as the USA. But the tropical climate also makes for a treacherous landscape. Worms, parasites, and insects find ideal conditions here. Mosquitoes transmit diseases such as malaria or yellow fever, a problem for the European plantation owners who settled on the Mississippi. The diseases killed off the white workers. Some people from Africa, however, were immune to these diseases thanks to a genetic mutation. From the 17th century onwards, they were abducted and enslaved in large numbers. Even though they were declared free people after the American Civil War, the foundations were laid for a two-class society in the USA.
Black folks fall behind every single generation. Redlining is at the root of it. Racism is at the root of it. Jim Crow is at the root of it.
Jim Crow is a distorted caricature of a singing, dancing black man presented by white people in shows. To this day, the name stands for the segregation laws in the USA. They permeated all areas of life in the US South until the 1960s. Blacks had to use separate waiting rooms or compartments on the train. They ate separately. Their right to vote was made more difficult. The map shows the states in which joint schooling of blacks and whites was still prohibited in 1954. In the Great Migration between 1916 and 1970, attracted by jobs, 6 million black people moved to the supposedly liberal North, for example, to Baltimore. To this day, you can see in the traditionally black neighborhoods here that blacks as a population group are still consistently disadvantaged here too. These poor conditions are the result of an old law from 1934. The so-called National Housing Act was supposed to make it possible for more people to own their own houses. But when only a few black people lived in a neighborhood, the entire area was marked as a red zone. Its residents were branded as not being creditworthy. As a result, most of them could never afford their own house. Green areas, on the other hand, were rich neighborhoods where residents could easily get loans. In this way, inequality grew. A rift opened up.
It also dealt with whether or not there were going to be parks and green space in the communities. Green line and blue line communities, you have more homeowners, you have larger sidewalks, you have park spaces, you have more trees. It's a difference between a concrete jungle and having a park for your child to play in.
No one invested in the red zones because they consisted almost exclusively of rented apartments, and no one improved on their tenements. Supermarkets only opened up in the richer parts of the city. Investments flowed into playgrounds, schools, and parks. The gap could not be bridged, so one's future was automatically determined at birth.
Research shows that a black boy born in Baltimore City in poverty will never get out of that condition. It's not just integrated racism and systemic racism, it's structural racism. It's the barriers that keep black communities from moving forward.
Sometimes even literally, like here on Franklin Street. This motorway is known as the Highway to Nowhere because its construction was never completed and it ends after only 2.2 kilometers. Also because of it, many residents are cut off from important infrastructure.
So if we go back and we look at this notion of the highway to nowhere, it was putting money into automobiles and not public transportation. What is unusual in a lot of these highway situations, they butt right up against economically challenged communities where people don't have access to cars. It cuts down on their access to public transportation.
Healthy food is also harder to come by in the red districts. The small corner shops are dominated by pre-packaged convenience foods. Many of these neighborhoods are classified as food deserts. By definition, 1/3 of the residents in such an area live 1 mile, that's 1.6 kilometers or more, from the nearest supermarket. The sad result is that the mortality rate from diabetes is twice as high in these areas as it is elsewhere.
They're sort of trapped in the community, and because of them being trapped like that, they're limited to where they can spend their subsidized funds. And it seems like it's seemingly getting more and more of a challenge for them to even find a place to do that. So for them to get to the box stores now, they have to take Uber or whatever because a lot of them are deprived of vehicles. And of course, when you go to Uber and all, that's taking more of their income. And it seems like something that needs to be taken into consideration when the government, the state, the mayor, whatever, considers these neighborhoods.
In problem cities like Baltimore, structural racism is at least being talked about today, but it's deeply cemented, also in the tax, school, and college system of the entire USA. Yet still, major cities are the best testimony to the economic success of the USA. It starts in the Chicago area and is determined by the shape of the Earth's surface around the Great Lakes. The land here is rich in mineral resources. Coal and iron ore, the raw materials for steel, are stored in and around the Appalachian Mountains and lakes. The Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and a network of rivers provide navigable waterways to the Atlantic Ocean.
In the 19th century, the USA was the only country on the continent that had all the raw materials it needed for industrialization in its own country. That's something you don't find anywhere else. Iron ore, coal deposits, and all the other minerals needed for industrialization. All the other countries had 1 or 2 raw materials, but never all the ones you'd need.
Raw materials were transported by rail or ship to cities like Chicago, where they were processed in factories. The industry attracted millions of immigrants from Europe who were looking for work. Initially, they came mainly from the British Isles and Scandinavia. But in the middle of the 19th century, it was mostly Germans who came. They brought with them their beer to America and replaced whiskey in the saloons as the favorite alcoholic drink. They introduced kindergartens. That's why they're still called kindergarten in the USA. And bowling, which is so popular today, also goes back to the German 9-pin bowling or skittles. That applies to sport in general. In their homeland, the gymnastics movement was part of a political idea. The Germans brought it with them to the USA. And the first thing they needed was space, which they didn't have in the cramped tenements. On their initiative, public parks and sports facilities were expanded. Today, Chicago alone has 580 parks, over 3,500 hectares of green space, and 307 fields for American football, soccer, and the like. Over time, schools also discovered the benefits of sport and promoted team sports.
The object was to teach the children how to become good Americans, right? They did this kind of unconsciously. So the way that it worked was they would teach them American sports and games rather than German gymnastics, such as baseball or football or basketball, team games. And the idea was to teach them how to become a good Americans through competition, because competition is the basis for the capitalist system. They wanted them to become good capitalists.
The notion persists to this day, and sport has become an integral part of the national identity.
Sports is part of who I am. I've used it for various outlets. Being new to a city, as in Chicago, where I found basketball leagues, football leagues, even going to play soccer. I use it as an outlet for college, something to keep in shape, to play competitively. I use it as a little kid to fit in. Someone who's tall, I use it as an outlet to utilize my height.
For many, an athletic scholarship is the only way to finance a college education, and it's one reason why the US is becoming the proverbial melting pot of the world.
You pick the best players, regardless of their race or ethnicity, to be on the team if you wanted to beat the other teams. And so this is how sports help to break down racism and nationalism in the US and become a country of many, many different ethnicities. And sports was largely the reason for that.
In the north of the USA, it's mainly people of German descent, shown here in red. Elsewhere, other ethnic groups dominate. English, Irish, Polish, or Russian. Also people of African American descent. The third largest group after Germans and African Americans are now Hispanics, mainly from Mexico, with 37 million people. They all dreamed of a land of unlimited opportunities. Their hopes rested on a continent that seemed to provide everything in abundance. But this self-styled image is being challenged anew in the 21st century. The consequences of man-made climate change are altering the natural environment of North America. What was part of a natural cycle is getting more and more out of control. The future will show whether Americans can also accept this challenge.